President, Governor Landon, Franklin, Dr. Haida. Talking about not the future of American involvement in the world, I'm not a little conscious of being here in the other Manhattan, or I guess you say the one I come from is the other Manhattan, a place which is so much associated in our minds with the capacity to decide this question, it being the assumption that the seaboards of the nation are always very much involved with world affairs, and that it is the great heartland, as it's called, which in a sense has the balancing option to involve itself or not, an option which we very much discussed at this time in our history. It would be perhaps more appropriate for me to be out in the audience and you up here. I think of the occasion on which Oscar Wilde was taken to view Niagara Falls. And he stared a moment and said, you know, it would be more impressive if it flowed the other way. But the dictates of an ancient medieval arrangement, which we call universities, is that the older people talk to the younger ones in settings just such as this. When Sigmund Freud came to a setting such as this at Clark University on the subject of honorary degrees, Freud came to the United States in 1910 to receive a degree from Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he's recalled as having said, America is a mistake. And he was not the only Middle European to have held this view, including many who not only came to the United States, but who stayed. Nor yet has this been a view confined to Middle Europeans. Increasingly, it is a view held around the world, and perhaps not least in the United States itself. There's a duality to this view of America. Much as Americans themselves in public opinion surveys have got into the habit of stating that their personal situation in life has improved and that they expect it to go on improving, but that the condition of their country has worsened and they expect it to go on worsening. Throughout the world, one will encounter persons of considerable or at least sufficient knowledge who think the United States an unrelieved political and cultural and social disaster, who are yet quite willing to move here or to have their children and their nephews educated here and emigrated here. For what it may be worth, it seems to me that this view is the accumulation of both American and European misapprehensions, which now spread around the world through the normal processes by which ideas diffuse, and the special ones by which they spread through the medium of empire. In this case, European empire, as in the case of India, and of course other such processes as well. Toward the end of my tour as ambassador in India, I found myself reflecting on this condition, and I wrote an article for the March issue of Commentary entitled The United States in Opposition. And at the invitation of Dr. Haida, I thought I would pursue some of the thoughts of that article here this morning. Since leaving India barely 4 months ago, it appears to me that the condition of which I was writing has become even more pronounced. The United States policies have been visited by calamities of a kind that appear to confirm the least sympathetic interpretations of America's past actions, whilst even from regions of more or less reliable goodwill, there emanates a no longer faint suggestion of Schadenfreude. So now we have got from one Freud to another and we've gone on our subject. I suggest, in suggesting that the United States go into opposition in world forums, especially where relations with the new nations are concerned, I was moved by, it seems to me, three considerations. The first is that I believe that we, the United States, share fundamental political values, ideological values, if you don't mind that term, with these new nations in the way that we don't share values with the totalitarian world. We do with this new world, at least with most of it, with most of its members. Almost without exception, the elites that took over at the time of independence from colonial rule were fundamentally committed to democratic processes. And some have been very successful in maintaining these processes. A pattern which, if you will, began with the Irish Free State in the 1920s, or, if you like, began with the United States of America 2 centuries ago. Now, this was true equally, of course, of the Latin American states that came into being with Bolivar. And, of course, not all turned into Jeffersonian democracies. Yet, those ideals live in Latin America, and in my possibly mistaken view, they also live in Africa, in South Asia, and such parts of the world. I've learned some things since coming from India, and I feel that I may have overlooked in what I wrote there the direct influence of Soviet and Chinese Marxism in some African states. And I think I see clearly now that the origins of Latin American international economic doctrines originate much more in the actual experience of a trading world dominated by United States interests than in the influence of collectivist doctrines from the new nations, which they in turn had acquired from the European capitals whence they had once been governed. And yet I've grown more and not less convinced that the dynamics of the modern world can only be understood by thinking in terms of three great modern political revolutions and not just two. It seems to me that in the much of the 20th century, notably the last quarter century, we have seen the world as being defined by two enormous events. First, the American and the French Revolution, if you will, the late 18th century libertarian, liberal revolution, which we associate with ourselves and with the doctrines that were so dominant in the world in the 19th century, such that if you were starting up a new government in a country around the world, in Argentina, in anywhere you might mention, in 1840, without even much thinking of the matter, you would find yourself fashioning an arrangement rather like Madison would have approved. I mean, you'd have a constitution, and you'd have a legislature, and you'd have an executive, and you'd have a judiciary, and you'd have a Bill of Rights. And this arrangement was ideologically dominant in the world for the longest time, and reached its peak of influence in 1918, when an almost similar arrangement was provided for a world system of governance in the League of Nations, a prestige which was oddly associated with the personal prestige of Woodrow Wilson. I think Governor Landon, who would remember those days, would agree that no American president ever before had attained to the influence Wilson had in the world, and none has ever since. No man has since, for that matter. And yet, simultaneously, a second event had occurred, what it came to be known as the Russian Revolution, a year earlier. And in a very similar pattern for the next 40 years, the dominant ideological drive in the world was associated with this particular ideology, which reached its peak certainly with the success in China in 1948, and again, curiously, with the dominance of Stalin as a world figure. And in the aftermath of those two events, we commenced a long Cold War, as you will, and seeing these as the two major competing political systems of the world. I argue that, in fact, a third event occurred. And again, it had occurred a year earlier than the preceding one, and that was the event in 1947 when a socialist government in England, Britain, gave independence to a socialist country of India. And there commenced the enormous sequence of the creation of new nations, 47 of them from the British Empire alone, which came into the world not as candidate members of NATO or the Warsaw Pact, but as nations with a distinct ideological history, a coherent set of views, and a precise set, or fairly precise set of doctrines, which define a position in a rather Hegelian sequence, if you will, that from as a kind of synthesis of the libertarian and the totalitarian alternatives of the first two events. A doctrine which Samuel Beard, Harvard University, has termed collectivism, and which seems to me to be an appropriate term, because it is neither, certainly not libertarian in the old sense, certainly not totalitarian in any sense, and yet it is in curious ways not a blend of the two, but a distinctive view of society and of the world, which emerges out of the conflict of the two earlier patterns. It's not a compromise, it is a distinctly Hegelian sequence, if you don't mind that notion. I believe the evidence exists that there has been a more or less conscious transfer of the socialist analysis of the condition of the European working classes to a parallel analysis of a class of nations, and with parallel prescriptions in response. Although it is more familiar to speak in terms of socialist prescriptions, I repeat that I think that Beer's term collectivism is far the more useful, simply because it accurately reflects a genuine societal conviction that is distinct from and away from the individualism of the British past, and for that matter of our past. Remember that with the rise of the Labour Party in Britain, it was the Liberal Party that disappeared, in effect, not the Tory Party, which found collectivism quite compatible to its own long-established Tory views. My second consideration derives from the first concerning these new nations, that the shared ideals we had led to shared interests, that we do in fact desire the well-being and the success of these new nations. And of course those who are like us, the old new nations of the Western Hemisphere. And we desire their independence also. My third consideration was that given their political history of colonial rule and their ideological history of socialist defiance to that condition and their present condition of considerable weakness, the new nations are not likely to reciprocate any of these sentiments for a very long time to come. In the meantime, they will use their voting majorities, where voting is the practice, and their increasingly manifest rhetorical advantage in ways both troubling to the United States and on occasion damaging to us also, damaging in a way I will discuss later, and not the way not the direct relation that I think is generally perceived. And in doing this, it seems to me, they damage their own interests as well, certainly to the extent that they make it difficult for us to pursue in any essentially productive way a perception of shared interests with them. This has been and will be a process which the totalitarian powers have no great difficulty exploiting to their own advantage. Thus, I concluded that our most effective role would be one of entering into, in the analogous parliamentary role, the loyal opposition. I spoke to some journalists this morning and said the position I would describe would be, let us say, that of the Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate in Topeka. I hope it's not quite as permanent a position of being in a minority as my party seems to enjoy in your capital, but the fact is that because the Democratic minority, as we're all aware, there's a Republican minority, the Republican minority does not go into a setting of where the votes have been counted in advance and come out amazed and surprised that they didn't win if a vote were taken, as it were. And nor neither do they leave if they aren't going to win. They stay and they offer alternatives, and they try to suggest that theirs is a better way of doing it, and they try to persuade the various publics which are watching on. And it is we have discovered this to be not the worst way to run the country, and it seems to me with good reason. And it seems to me that the effort to present an American case as forcefully and constructively as possible, presenting American alternatives, and being quite prepared to lose the vote where such matters come to a vote, but hoping in the process to make some points, to change some minds, is a respectable and responsible a response to a condition which has now got a certain quasi-permanence about it. I have since been influenced and informed by a number of recent statements, not least by Ambassador John Scally, who, for example, said in Boston last January that the United Nations is strong enough to withstand such criticism and is flexible enough to profit from it and is important enough to justify it. The great problem of our time in these regards is how to make a persuasive case that these matters are important, and if we are to stay with them, we must be prepared to take them seriously. And taking them seriously requires a certain amount of reaction to things that you don't think make sense and you don't approve and you don't like. And that the alternative of just going along ends with getting out. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. I've come also, and not for the first time, to see the wisdom of the Council of Harlan Cleveland, who has been an ambassador to NATO, an assistant secretary of state in charge of international organization affairs, who makes the unassailable point that apart from the Security Council of the United Nations and possibly a very few other bodies, voting simply cannot be the normal mode of collective decision-making in world affairs. Decisions have to be made by consensus. One could note, for example, that the parliamentary style of voting, which comes to us and to much of the world from the British House of Commons practice, is a little bit deceptive. Of course there is voting, but except on the rarest occasions in the Commons and in the Lords for that matter, voting is a pro forma statement of a distribution of power already known. It's a simple exercise reflecting the known division of votes in either house as between competing parties, one of which under the British Constitution governs absolutely, while the others are in fact governed. By contrast, and voting takes place in situations that were of unequal powers. By contrast, in the cabinet, where the equals gather, with one the prime equal perhaps, but when equal members of the governing party gather, they do not vote. I remember Clement Attlee once put it to me a rather nice phrase. He said, I asked him, do you ever vote? He said, of course we don't vote. He said, I take the voices. And not to have consensus in the cabinet, and to go forward anyway with a policy which a significant number of the cabinet disapprove is automatically to initiate a political crisis. And I think that the analogy in the experience is effective, is comparable and legitimate. That we can learn from the political experience of those who've dealt with situations comparable to international gatherings. International decisions have to be reached by a mediating process, not a dividing one. On the other hand, this is very different from assuming that in the quest for something wholly called consensus, the United States must end by abandoning its own interests, which I would hope it at all time include an intelligent appreciation and concern for the interests of other nations with whose fortunes ours are so inextricably combined. There has got to be an end to this, and there are signs that there will be. In the Washington Post not long ago, Stephen Rosenfeld reported that the worm did indeed turn, an image all could agree upon, I suppose, at a meeting recently held of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO as it's called, at Lima, Peru. The delegates were there busy at redistributing the world's resources by acclamation. And everything went along pretty much as it once would have done. But this time we did not go along. And Rosenfeld writes that forsaking mush, the United States said to the really poor and the formerly poor countries of the Third World, gentlemen, you think one way about the world's economy and we think another. We will no longer blur these differences of principle to accommodate you. We insist that these differences be negotiated out. We will no longer apologize in third world company for our economic successes, such as they are, for our still high standard of living, for our technology, our productivity, for our inventive corporations, and for our free enterprise system. Hopefully we won't boast of them either, but in international society we'll tell it more like it is. Now, this, it seems to me, is heartening. If, as it turns out, it does no particular good for other nations, it might do some good for us. Just to hear the American case stated, to know there is one. I would not, however, expect it to be stated very well, for the reason that we ourselves are not overly much persuaded of it. If you don't think so, spend a half hour, as I did very pleasantly yesterday, in the very handsome bookstore of the Student Union, and see what books are read, and ask what is in fact their import, and it is scarcely celebratory. Put it that way. The disdain for America, so much in place in the rest of the world, is part of a tradition almost of Western political thinking, and in that sense, a part of the American tradition too. I think we do not know how much it is part of the doctrines of most of the rest of the world that not only wish they to be different from the American model of which is such an old model now, but actively to be opposed to it. And we are not so different from our own critics in that sense. And Joseph Schumpeter foresaw this in his great book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He foresaw the process whereby capitalist culture produces fiercely anti-capitalist critics among intellectuals, a process which is not only natural to the thing, but necessary, because the same dynamic that makes capitalism an effective system of economic production is the dynamic that is an intellectual dynamic, and that an aspect of that intellectuality will eventually turn on that which it has created, and indeed it does. And again, I refer you to the bookstore. But and I think that this just self-knowledge of this is at least something, as I think even Freud would have agreed. And and not just a self-knowledge, but an awareness that we are all just a bit automatonic in this matter, that we are saying things that men long dead and gone quite accurately said we would be saying. That ought to give pause a little bit to the conviction of the absolute authenticity of what is said. For example, I wasn't at Lima, and I know no more than the Washington Post reports, but one may assume, for example, that multinational corporations, most of them American-based, came in for the most intense criticism and were scheduled as an international institution for early dissolution. And I don't know what the chief American delegate said about this, and I would hope he may have said something, but I wouldn't necessarily be, and if he did, it would be one of the few such occasions. But it's worth noting that there would have been at Lima a number of delegations which could very well have borne witness to the immense, nay, indispensable importance to the development of less developed economies of multinational enterprises. And those would have been, of course, the delegations from the Warsaw Pact, and most particularly from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That economy, I think, as has been demonstrated, will go to very considerable lengths. Some have even remarked extraordinary lengths to attract such companies, American included, to their lands. And presumably they will do for rational reasons, or at very least reasons sufficient for them, and other communist regimes in the world do very much the same kind of thing. They will go to the greatest extent to involve themselves with American capitalist enterprise, which enterprise is excoriated in forms the world over where they sit and say nothing, and where when we respond it is assumed to be an act of unmitigated self-interest, if not aggression. Indeed, if one were looking around the world for old-fashioned conspiracies, it seems to be none is likely to prove more rewarding as an opportunity for exposure of the effort to drive American business out of the non-communist countries of the world, out of Africa, South Asia, South Latin America, in order to do what? Could it be that it's in order that the communist nations might have a monopoly on the advantage that comes from collaboration with multinational enterprise? In order that those economies might grow strong and the others weak, so that eventually the weak will fall prey to the strong? Fantasy? Well, yes, but I assure you that more unlikely tales are believed around the world. I, for one, had more than a few occasions to wonder about it, quite seriously to wonder about it, during my time in India, as I watched one American corporation after another which had tried genuinely to begin activities in India and with Indians, to build fertilizer plants and find minerals, look for oil, make steel. One after another, I saw those very same companies which had broken their pick in India in the 1960s, opening operations in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. and being more than welcomed there. Indeed, the pattern became so conspicuous that even the Communist Party of India felt called upon to explain what was going on. And the explanation, if you will, was that the Soviet regime, being more mature than Indian socialism, could more readily take the risk of dealing with the devil. This may be the first statement ever by Westerners or on behalf of Westerners concerning Easterners, which Indian intellectuals did not find patronizing. I don't know whether this conspiracy will ever be exposed, in the sense that it will ever occur to the nations involved that they may be being touted off Western technology that just possibly by ideologues who just possibly are persuading them to do, not to do for themselves what they might do because it is in the interest that others have access to that very technology. In any event, just now these new nations are not much in the mood to listen to such cautionary advice. They wouldn't pay attention whatever to what I just said. At least in part, I think, because they have learned rather the wrong lesson from the success of OPEC in so very greatly changing the price of energy in the world and in bringing about an immense transfer of wealth from the developed parts of the world to the so-called undeveloped through that price increase. Some, at least of the new nations, seem absorbed by the possibility that they might hit on similar schemes themselves. And that this possibility seems to me to have distracted many of them from the absolutely devastating impact which those price increases have had on their own economy. India, to mention one nation, well known to this university and well loved here, I think, admired, I hope, admired and admiration in which I certainly would want to be counted a participant. India has solidly backed the moves that quadrupled the price of fertilizer on which its green revolution so utterly depends. And in the aftermath, the government, which had sincerely hoped never again to accept American concessional food aid, was forced to realize that it had no choice but to go back to the days of PL 480 food shipments, which have now recommenced. Such that far from being a blow for the independence of the new nations of the world, the oil price increases in that respect increased the dependence of India, such as you could describe the need for concessional food as an aspect of dependence. It was not, excepting for the 13 nations involved, an event to which the rest of the poor countries of the world could automatically associate themselves and think of as being, in their direct sense, self-interest. And the whole question of how much more such commodity agreements will have the same kind of debilitating effects upon the majority of the countries, and certainly the majority of the peoples of the poor parts of the world, is one would hope would be examined by them as they move into a very clear consideration of just such future steps. In any event, the processes by which a United States could restore a measure of respect in international forums for our positions is bound to be a slow one. I think it is clear that the world is in for a bad time, and that the worst is not yet, and that we are going to be for a very long while a much beleaguered nation. But setbacks compound at a rate that startles me. I have never myself been quite so convinced that a dynamic of decline is somehow set in, a long time decline perhaps, but a real one. The most ominous event touching on the matters which I have been speaking generally was the meeting just concluded in Havana of the Non-Aligned Coordination Bureau. This is the steering committee of the 70-odd nations of the Non-Aligned Group, which will meet in Lima next July, to prepare their position for the coming 29th General Assembly. If I understand the view which they have taken, it is one of a quite exceptional assault upon what we have come to see as constitutional proceedings in the United Nations, and in particular a decision to move for the expulsion of yet more countries, or at least one further country, on grounds basically of political differences and not of illegality. There's no mistaking the language of the declaration which concluded the Havana Conference on the, quote, adventures of Zionism and colonialism, for which read the United States, for Israel and the United States, with respect to the intended action that would follow. I read the declaration. It says, the Bureau of the Non-Aligned Countries has condemned more than once Israel's policy and has denounced the behavior of the United States to make Israel a vanguard base of colonialism and imperialism within the Third World, and to use it to break the liberation movements, threaten peace and security in developing countries, steal their wealth, and then it says, etc. Now, the proposed line of action is clear and presumably follows from the expulsion last year of another country from the General Assembly. The declaration reads, the Bureau believes the time is ripe for the non-aligned countries to consider broader measures against Israel, including dismissal from the United Nations. This raises an ominous prospect because such an effort can be made. Now, Israel cannot be dismissed and won't dismissed indeed, but the effort to do so would be altogether counterproductive, and so much and so obviously that even an advocate of plain speech such as myself can on this occasion revert to the pattern of diplomatic indirection. Let me speak finally to a general concern. Several years in South Asia have convinced me that a rhetorical dynamic has taken hold in the new nations which is so routinely and at times almost mindlessly anti-Western, often anti-American, that America, for example, has come to be held responsible not only for its own misdeeds, which no doubt exist and should be counted against us, but the misdeeds of all the powers of the world. We are blamed for what the old colonial powers did as a kind of successor in bankruptcy to their villainy. We are blamed for what the new totalitarian powers do as a kind of surrogate, it being generally understood that it's dangerous to blame them directly. It gets a little manic at times, and at times it is clearly not meant to be taken too seriously, and yet it is. It has a cumulative impact here in the United States, such that the inclination on our part simply to withdraw from those encounters is unmistakable. And let me be clear now, and complex at the same time. In part, this inclination to withdraw arises out of annoyance and disappointment with what seem to many of us to be unwarranted charges. But in part also it arises from the fact that the charges are believed are accepted. The Secretary of State has put it well when he noted that in the past American isolationism arose because we thought ourselves too good for the rest of the world, but increasingly of late it arises from the feeling that we are not good enough. One would like to know if it is possible even for other nations so different from us to understand the peculiarly Protestant experience of conscience which pervades our political culture to this day, such that they could really appreciate that the true danger of their rhetoric is that we will come to believe it. I would not conceal my own conviction that a very considerable portion of our educated young people in the United States already do so. And as they grow up and become the norm of a leadership in this country, and we begin as to withdraw as a matter of conscience from our involvement with the rest of the world, the new nations of the world, leaving those necessarily tentative regimes in so many cases, and even the solid and competent regimes such as India, more and more dependent on the support from totalitarian regimes. We leave them more and more dependent on support from totalitarian regimes which in their nature cannot wish them, in fact, to succeed, but do indeed desire in the end that they fail. Already, throughout among the new nations, one encounters governments increasingly dependent on minority Marxist policies, hewing to that ancient Stalinist tactic, the worse the better. And as things grow relatively worse, so does the dependence of those regimes on such support that totalitarians seem to be able to provide them. And of course, irony of ironies, this dependence could come to be mirrored here in the United States. For even a country as big as and as independent, self-sufficient as ours needs a kind word somewhere. And increasingly we find that it is in our relations with the totalitarian nations that we can obtain some measure of approval for what we do and some legitimation of what we are. An approval and a legitimation which I find ominous in the extreme, but in a curious way, all of those nations in the world, and they are a majority of the nations and a majority of the peoples of the world, whose fundamental tradition is democratic, whose ideals are libertarian as well as collectivist where that is the case, we find ourselves increasingly turning for support to nations whose ideologies cannot be but directly and implacably opposed to our own. That is a diplomatic success for the others, which I think few could have imagined just a few years ago, and yet is at least potentially in prospect. And so I take no very great cheer from this time, and yet I would leave you with a thought that things have been worse, and if you would like a witness to things who were worse, a witness to things when they were worse, it is in the person of the man whose great name is attached to this letter, this lecture series, Governor Alfred M. Landon, who in 1938, Governor, you must remember this, was the deputy head of the United States delegation to the Lima Conference of the International Conference of American States, which was held in December in Lima, Peru, that year. 21 American republics represented, and the United States, apprehensive of the efforts of Nazi Germany to extend its economic and political influence in certain states of Latin America, sought approval of an inter-American consultation arrangements whereby this might be resisted and whereby common measures of defense could be discussed. And the United States proposal met with very little success at first. Argentina firmly opposed any such measure, and it was supported by Uruguay and Paraguay and Bolivia and Chile and Brazil, at which point you have 3/4 of the people of Latin America, and they would have nothing to do with joining with us in some resistance to the inroads of Nazism and fascism. And yet, before the conference was over, no doubt with Governor Landon's persuasiveness, how could they say no to such a man, a kind of an agreement was reached. And as the agreement itself seemed to have the effect of increasing the perception of how important and real the problem was. And before the decade was out, and as the World War was about to begin, there was a measure of unity in the Western Hemisphere which brought us through that war untouched in what could have been a dangerous, if not indeed fatally dangerous experience. In the end, there was a lot of common sense and a common perception of interest. If I have any one grounds for feeling optimistic in a time when there don't seem to be many, it arises from an absolute conviction of the shared interests and the shared beliefs which the United States holds with countries such as India in this world, and a feeling that out of that common interest can, in the end, come something sufficient by way of common cause. Thank you, Mr. President.
In the questions and answers which followed the prepared remarks by Dr. Moynihan, he was asked about meteorologists' predictions that the weather pattern in the world is changing, which will perhaps radically alter the growing seasons. He was asked if it's advisable then for the United States to be supplying so much grain to India through various programs. Should not we be stockpiling it? Here's Dr. Moynihan's answer.
Well, of course, that we're not shipping that much to, the PL-480 shipments are somewhat under 1 million tons this year. India bought 2 million tons of grain for cash in the United States before it had to start, had to get some concessional. And these are concessional shipments. They're paid for eventually, let me be clear. I think the distinction between buying and borrowing is not there's no distinction in terms of whether the wheat leaves the country. And the question of stockpiling is obviously one of the first before the World Food Council, which was established at the World Food Conference in October last year. And the question of how do you maintain a world stockpile, we are down to only about 1 month's supply of food in the world, the lowest grain supplies we've had in 30 years. And one of the nice things about Kansas, and it's changed in 30, 40 years, Governor, is that you used not to be as internationalist as you are today because you used not to ship as much grain abroad. But 60% of the grain available for export in the world is grown in the United States, and it's a fundamental fact and an important one, and it's a responsibility. Sometimes people hesitate to refer to the United States as a power, and yet power implies responsibility, and not to deny power in many ways is to deny responsibility. Any country that produces 60% of the food available for export in the world, the grain, has responsibility, just that fact, and obviously some kind of stockpiling, some kind of food reserve is in order. Whether or not the food reserve for us consists of the livestock feeding programs, which can be shifted to more direct consumption of grain, I don't know. I don't present myself as anybody competent. But why do you say the meteorologists say, are the meteorologists speaking in terms of the next 12 months or the next 20 years, the Ice Age coming theory?
Ice Age coming theory.
Ice Age coming theory.
Which is generally not given very wide credence. But of course, the energy situation wasn't given very much credence in 1970 either.
But you distinguish between, you say the Ice Age theory isn't given much credence, but the energy situation wasn't given much credence either. But but I mean, human beings changed the price of oil. I don't know whether human beings changed the weather, but maybe we do affect it. Whether that long cycle, I don't know.
You know that the price of oil is obviously going to change.
Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah, and you can know it's going to run out and things like that. Sure, quite so. On that subject, the subject you raised, I am here to be instructed, not to instruct. If you say the Ice Age is coming and we ought to have stockpiles, I'm fair to hear more. Well, I think you're, one more question. Did you have a question, sir?
Professor Moynihan, regarding the investing and divesting of multinational corporations and panels, position papers and studies done by Congress, the OAS, the UN, and other international governmental organizations, it seems as though the multinationals are assuming a major role in projecting the U.S. image or even policies into these developing countries. Is that valid? Is it advisable to let IBM, Coca-Cola project these images?
Well, that's a good question, and I hope you have a better answer than I do. Good for you to mention Coca-Cola, which is a symbol of the United States all over the world, and it's something that drives intellectuals crazy. We are known as the Coca-Cola culture. It came to Europe just after the war, and it's drives them mad. It's everything that is inappropriate. It's opposed to their traditions, whatever they might be, of drinking what they do. It's meretricious. It's all the things that it's consumer. It's a frivolity. It's something that whatever it does, it doesn't do you any good, and it's a form of cultural imperialism, well, economic imperialism, and so on. It's also two other things. One, it's obviously a great business invention. The Coca-Cola Company earlier in its history, for reasons that it was short of working capital, developed techniques of licensing distributors and not doing it all itself. They just licensed people to do it. So they got into India with the American troops in the Second World War and left behind Coca-Cola there, as they did all over the world, as an Indian corporation. And in fact, it's not an American corporation. It's licensee, and the Indians run it. And that's turned out to be a very effective way to do business. It's an invention. It's a creative one. The second thing about Coca-Cola is that it is good for you. In most of those parts of the world, water is poison, and Coca-Cola is not. And it's the most and the difference between poison water and non-poison water is a big difference if you've ever had to make a choice. I can't imagine. I never knew what an atavistic attachment I had for that innocent drink till I started living in South Asia. I don't think I'd had 3 Coca-Colas in 25 years. But I had a lot more in the months that follow. I mean, it is an immensely important form of public health. I mean, it has brought pure drink to places which, and without which, you live in a place where there's no way to drink except to poison yourself. And you will find that it's not, people aren't as busy and they aren't as enterprising. They don't work like Kansas farmers. It's all they can do is drag themselves around their fields with a pointed stick all day. And you get rid of get your system working and stop supporting. I mean, it's been calculated by a couple of MIT biologists that the amount of food eaten consumed by parasites in these countries, and in a case for making cost effectiveness for purifying water, to say that every $1 million spent purifying water saves $4 million worth of drain over 17 years, that kind of thing. You can actually calculate it, probably pretty accurately. Fact is, those companies unavoidably symbolize the United States. None of them is anywhere. I mean, they obviously got many sins. I mean, but they're the venial sins of people making money. Adam Smith observed that nobody's ever so innocently engaged as when he's just trying to make money. I mean, otherwise, the people's energies go to very less pleasant things, I assure you. I'm not a defender of American capitalism, for God's sakes. Just saying, as a productive arrangement, it's not bad. And that these systems are not where they are because no one wants them. And particularly the consumer, things like Coca-Cola, people find it very definitely valuable to them. And for perfectly good reasons. I suspect when Coca-Cola began in this country, the water everywhere wasn't so pure. Don't forget, we're not so far away from a world in which, we had cholera in New York City in the 1870s. And there is nonetheless, not to be made a mistake, extractive industries necessarily arouse concern. And particularly when it's an extractive industry in a small country, where in fact they don't have much. And if the big company is just so much bigger. I mean, there are only about 15 countries in the world that have a gross national product larger than the sales of Exxon and General Motors, And that question of imbalance is real. It's a legitimate one. It's one we've addressed ourselves to with respect to corporations internally. The whole question of dealing with the phenomenon of the corporation. This university is a corporation. Kansas is a corporation. GM is a corporation. Is something we're only just beginning to understand. It comes out of our medieval experience. James S. Coleman has written a very fine beginning book on the subject, Coleman at the University of Chicago. But you don't deal with the problems of, if you find a large corporation, a corporate thing is against an individual thing, causes problems for you. You don't necessarily make those problems easier by creating a yet greater corporation. And that, I think, has been the problem socialists have encountered in practice wherever they've gone. They said, we will overcome the power of the steel corporations by nationalizing them, which only leaves you with one huger corporation than you had when you had before. I would say this, however: the United States should do two things. It should say that with respect to legitimate questions of conduct and behavior, we have nothing to fear from, and much to desire, much to profit from. Respectable standards of codes of behavior, indeed, if necessary, regulated behavior. We found that to be our own experience in this country, and we have nothing much to be ashamed of in terms of the productive result. And remember, the problem of the world is production. We don't grow enough food, we don't make enough things. And distribution comes after. That's a problem you can deal with after you've got something to distribute. As that much maligned man, the Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture, keeps saying, you can't eat food until you have grown it. And, not to know that is to, a lot of people, you'd be surprised the number of people who go to work in offices and wear suits who miss that point. We need the productivity of efficient economic organization, and we need, however, to be able to feel, we need countries to be able to feel that injustice is not being done, that national sovereignty is not being threatened, and that inequities, that exploitation is not, in fact, taking place of a sort of finite kind. When you look up one day and they've left you and they have all your bauxite and you've got nothing left but holes in the ground. Those are respectable things, Well, there's nothing in the American performance with respect to our own internal affairs which should suggest that we aren't capable of coming forward with a responsible resolution of this kind of question in international settings. Indeed, it seems to me that our experience is such, in terms of its success and its endurance in time, that it is we who ought to take the initiative rather than wait to have it thrust at us by people to whom the whole thing is a new encounter. Well, Mr. President, thank you very much.
You've been listening to a Landon Lecture with Dr. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, former U.S. Ambassador to India, the man rumored to be the new U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Dr. Moynihan speaking in McCain Auditorium on the Kansas State University the campus this morning, the 31st speaker in the distinguished series of Landon Lecturers on public issues. This has been a presentation of KSAC News and Public Affairs.